So, I'm going to be talking about a transgender YouTuber from Tumblr who uses lots of words to sound like they know what they're talking about. Not that one. 2017 seems to have been the year for the slideshow CC to do videos on social commentators. Doodle Channels allowed and Styles and Quiz did videos on Mr. Dapperton, Bondish Sprocket did a video on Liberal Ogre, and Sketch TV did a video on Armored Skeptic. I did consider doing videos on the dramas around either No Bullshit or Liz Reptile, but it seems those dramas were either resolved or have died out of relevancy, and I'd just come off as looking like a dick trying to revive them for the sake of making content. So rather than start an unneeded shitstorm with any of the social commentators or skeptics, I'm instead going to be tackling a video from one of their more infamous bandwagons, Riley J. Dennis. Much like Lily Pete, Riley is a transgender YouTuber who likes to think she's an intellectual. However, whereas Lily can usually get an audience to agree with her, and her main source of opposition is usually FNGR, Riley more often than not comes off as a rambly goofball, who gets responded to by numerous members of the Anti-SJW community. Also like Lily, Riley is infamous for blocking people who do videos on her. Or for no reason at all, really. Since she blocked Ray Rules 96 last year on Twitter, and I can't find a single video he's made on her or anything he said about her on Twitter. Considering he isn't an anti-SJW YouTuber or a skeptic YouTuber, I'm inclined to think Riley was just having a bout of paranoia that day. The video from Riley I'm responding to is about that lovely topic, racism. I've put this off long enough, let's get into it.
Look, before we get into this video, I just want to note that obviously I'm really white. And when I talk about white people, I don't mean it in a those white people kind of way, like I'm somehow detached from that. When I say white people, I mean myself included. I just don't want it to come across as like, I'm one of the good ones.
Considering you have a reputation for making videos like trying to defend Muslims and saying they aren't homophobic or transphobic, then yeah, I think I can say you're trying to come off as one of the good white people. Also, given how you focus on history that doesn't factor into modern day, it genuinely feels like you're trying to deflect the negative stigma white people have.
I'm still learning how to combat racism and white supremacy myself.
Care to tell us how you're dealing with either of those? Or are you just throwing those words out there because Tumblr's pretty much turned them into buzzwords at this point? Yeah, one thing you might have noticed about Riley is that she comes off as really skittish, and terrified of being judged by people she'll likely never meet in the real world. Later on in the video, I have to wonder if she's actually stepped outside her house since she turned 18.
So, I hope that makes sense. Anyway, the point of this video is that not all white people bullshit. If you don't know what I mean, let me give you an example. Let's say a person of color experiences some kind of racism from a white person. In frustration, they say, white people are horrible. At this point, you can expect some kind of white person to pop up out of the bushes and scream, not all white people, you shouldn't generalize us like that. That's reverse racism. These white people, the ones who constantly scream, not all white people, and reverse racism, argue that making a generalization about white people is just as bad as making a generalization about people of color.
Okay, a few things. You're kind of generalizing white people to be quick to offense and to defend themselves. You're also generalizing black people in that any old random black person would say white people in an irritated manner. Why were there bushes and why was a random white person crouching in them? Reverse racism? Am I watching that black family sitcom I can't remember the name of, where the dad got taken to court for calling an incompetent employee the dumbest white boy he ever saw?
Like a total surface level, you might think, yeah, that makes sense. Those statements are both generalizations about a race. But if you look just a little bit harder at the cultural, social, political, and historical context that these phrases are said in, it's pretty easy to see that they are not equivalent statements.
It's funny how you tell us to focus on all of that when you yourself focus on the historical and political context.
I mean, black people in the US were slaves, and then they were considered 3/5 of a person, and then they lived under Jim Crow segregation laws, and even today they still experience systemic racism on a daily basis.
Even today, huh? Then explain to me why a black man was president from 2009 to 2017. Riley, if we still lived back in the days of Crow segregation law, Barack Obama wouldn't have even been allowed to run for president. He likely wouldn't have had the funds for his campaign. He'd have likely been dirt poor.
The prejudice and discrimination that was built into our institutions and systems didn't go away overnight with the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Racism, and by extension, white supremacy, both still have a deep hold on this country. To be a person of color in the US today means to live under a system that was not only not built for you, but was built to harm you.
Yeah, back then. Today, black people have pretty much every single right and opportunity that a white person has. Just because there's still some racism in America, it doesn't mean it's as prevalent as it was before.
If you don't believe that people of color are marginalized and oppressed in a way that white people are not, you're just being willfully ignorant at this point.
Then please tell us how black people are still oppressed, Riley. Educate us on how, even though we've seemingly come so far in terms of racial equality, that racism and oppression still exists for black people. I mean, I know you aren't wrong, but you also aren't showing any proof. The biggest flaw with your video is you don't elaborate on anything you say, and just expect people to take your word for it. And really, that's a problem with a lot of your videos.
So I'm gonna assume that we can all agree on this. If we can't agree, I don't think I'm gonna be able to convince you, but there will be some links in the description if you'd like to challenge your worldview with some facts and statistics.
So I took a look at those articles you linked in your description there, and I'm sorry to say a lot of them feel like propaganda, especially considering this picture on Vanity Fair. And I feel the only reason you chose this one was because the villains are black.
Dragon Wheel! So when you say something in 2017, knowing everything that has happened up until now, your words live in the context of this time period, in this culture, in this political context. They can't be separated from that. So let's say you're a white person and you say, black people are horrible. In a greater context, you are a member of a group that oppressed black people for a long time and continues to do so today.
Damn it, Ryder, your editing is garbage. Not that I want to talk considering I cut myself off in the last interjection. In all seriousness though, I know quite a few people that are black, or at the very least half black. Never treated a single one of them like they were inferior to me due to the color of their skin. If anything, two of them take shots at me by calling me a skinny white dude. And even then, it's mostly friends joking around.
I can already hear the white people chiming in saying that they weren't alive during slavery, so they shouldn't be responsible for it. And like, sure, you're not directly responsible for slavery, but you continue to benefit from the oppression of black people, which has had its roots in slavery. That's a fact. And I know white people get really sensitive about this, and I get it. I used to be in middle school too.
I'm gonna say middle school is about as far as you care to go in terms of education. At no point in time have I ever heard of anyone in my family benefiting from the history of enslavement. For someone who says it's bad to generalize a group of people based on the color of their skin, you sure are generalizing a group of people based on the color of their skin.
I wanted to believe that I lived in a system that was fair and equal and didn't value me over someone else just because of the color of my skin. But then I grew up and I realized that racism was still very much alive.
Alright, Riley, where do you live that racism is still as much of a problem as it was back then in our dark days? Did the black people in your town need to go to a different school? Did they need to drink from a different fountain for black people? Because unless they did, I'm going to assume you're just talking out of your ass at this point.
So I'm not saying that white people need to hate themselves or have guilt over this. I just think we need to recognize our role as people who have benefited from racism and who are a part of a group that has oppressed and continues to oppress black people. And then we need to work to fight against that. And part of what that means is that when you, as a white person, say black people are horrible, your words are just perpetuating the oppression of black people that white people have been doing for a long time. You're continuing that racist cycle. You're adding fuel to the fire.
How? Provide a present-day example of how white people are oppressing black people.
On the other hand, if a black person says white people are horrible, it doesn't have that weight behind it. The power dynamics are completely different. It doesn't perpetuate systemic racism. It doesn't result in the institutional oppression of white people. It's just an expression of anger against an oppressor group. That's all there is to it. The two statements don't carry the same weight or historical context. For centuries, white people insulting black people has led to their enslavement, disenfranchisement, and oppression. Meanwhile, black people insulting white people hasn't had anywhere near the same impact on white people. They're just on completely different levels. And it's painfully simplistic to avoid all social, political, cultural, and historical context just to make these statements seem comparable.
And yet a few black people record themselves stomping a white kid to death shouting, "Fuck white people, fuck Donald Trump." Even then I consider it a case of people being terrible.
An analogy I can think of to demonstrate this kind of power dynamic in a really simple way is this. Imagine there's a queen and a peasant. Obviously the queen has a lot of power and the peasant does not have a lot of power. Now the peasant can point at the queen and say, "Throw her in jail," and it won't have any effect. The guards aren't going to listen to a peasant. But if the queen points to the peasant and says, "Throw her in jail," then the guards will listen and the peasant will end up in jail. Both parties said the same phrase directed towards the other one, but one of those phrases had a lot more power because of the context.
Here's where your comparison fails though. Someone like a queen is born to rule, and therefore has greater power than a peasant. Person A does not have power over person B just because person B has darker skin than them. You clearly want to come off as if you understand the nuance of racism, when in reality you're just proving how uninformed you truly are.
Okay, so context matters when it comes to generalizations, but also when white people say not all white people, they're usually taking a complaint about racism and making it about themselves. The only time I've heard generalizations from people of color about white people has been after a person of color has experienced some kind of racism. So, for example, let's say a person of color on Twitter tweets something about systemic racism. In response, they get a bunch of ignorant white people replying and calling them racial slurs and saying that racism doesn't exist and all of that. In response, they say something to the effect of, "I am so tired of white people. They're horrible." And that's when the not all white people crowd comes in. Some white person pops up and says, "Not all white people are like that. I'm one of the good ones." In this way, all that saying not all white people does is absolve that white person of any guilt and make the situation about them. Why do you have a need to insert yourself there and defend yourself?
Could be a number of reasons. In the context you just gave, it could be that they're being unfairly profiled by people that don't know anything about them but act like they do.
I don't give a shit. I don't give a fuck. I don't give a shit. I don't give a fuck.
I've never seen it improve a situation or combat racism in any way. I understand that you want to defend yourself and you feel like when someone makes a comment about white people that it affects you. But the truth of the matter is that you're going to be just fine. Generalizations about white people are not going to hurt you. They're not going to contribute to unfair housing discrimination against you or lead to a racial hiring bias against you because you're white.
The same thing could be argued about generalizations about black people, Riley. Garbage generalizations didn't keep Barack Obama from becoming president, James Earl Jones and Phil Lamar from becoming successful voice actors, Michael Jordan from being a celebrated basketball player, and they sure didn't keep George Washington Carver from being documented as the man who came up with 100 uses for the peanut. The rest of the video is just Riley saying hashtag not all white people won't keep white people from getting their feelings hurt, and that white people should just let it go. Which is funny coming from her, considering she didn't have to make this video in the first place. I look at this video and see someone who is terrified to be judged due to the color of her skin, and used this video as a means to defend herself while casting blame on the rest of the white people in America. So yes, Riley, I do see this video as you trying to say you're one of the good ones. You know what's funny? Riley may think she's defending people that can't defend themselves, when a lot of those people would either laugh in her face or look at her in contempt. She blatantly ignored things that contradicted her claims, and I can't for the life of me figure out why outside of Tumblr SJW mentality. From what I've seen, Riley's been doing this kind of thing for years, and she has absolutely no desire to change her views on anything. Hell, she considers aggressive language to be a form of violence. Anyways, I am Night saying thanks for listening, and please share your thoughts with me.